Garcia. What a long, strange trip it's been. Chuck, thank you very much. For those of you who may not be aware, our own retired Master Chief, Chuck Thompson, my partner in crime for the last couple of years on a project, and I had the distinct advantage of watching Chuck as he went from the transition from military life to civilian life. So I got to watch him make all of the mistakes first so I could figure out what not to do. But along the line there, I made a good friend of Chuck and his lovely wife, Twyla, and we've had a lot of good adventures, including driving. Why is it that I always have to end up driving? But from now on, what I want is from my family. I know what my next Christmas present request would be for a GPS.
I'll give 20 bucks.
Captain Pyle, I know your schedule is awfully busy with us trying to transition to the Surface Force Logistics Center, so I appreciate your presence today, sir. And Mr. Excerpt, thank you for providing us a spiritual compass today. I think in today's environment that's more important than ever. And to Lieutenant Robertson, good friend, an excellent boss. Lieutenant, thank you for always providing me with plenty of rope. And the wisdom that I won't hang myself with. Okay, I'd like to say some more thank yous, but first, one last sea story for the road, okay? This sea story takes place over 27 years, but I promise I won't take that long to tell it. 27 years ago in a dusty little desert town, I got on a Greyhound bus headed for boot camp in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. There to see me off that day was my father and my grandfather, and each of them shook my hand and offered me a little bit of advice, which I'd like to share now 27 years later. My grandfather said to me, "Davy boy, always do your best, because no one can ever ask more of you than that." Well, many, many years later, as I was serving in the Bering Sea on a ship, I received a message that my grandfather had passed. When the ship pulled in, I went to shore on a little Aleutian island and made a wreath of pine boughs and laid it at sea to remember my grandfather and the advice that he gave me. I've always tried to do my best, and even more importantly from him, I learned to accept others' best as well. Now, my father's advice was a little bit more specific, but before I tell you what he said, sorry, not swine flu. You have to understand that my father worked for the Navy for 44 years as a civil servant on the Navy's ordnance test ranges. So as a child, I was regularly treated to pictures of something being blown to smithereens. A piece of a bomb or a missile fragment, maybe even the hand of a ejection seat test dummy that didn't quite make it through the test. Regardless, my father also, as soon as I was big enough to hold a gun, he put one in my hand and taught me how to use it safely and made sure that I got all the proper safety schools for it. So I think you can see that that spark that my father's love gave to me as a little small boy bloomed into a career that's now lasted almost 28 years. On that day, he shook my hand and he told me two things. He said, "Dave, make sure that you write to your mother, and never borrow money from that loan shark in the barracks. You know, that guy that'll loan you 20 bucks for 40 bucks on payday." Well, my father couldn't make it here today because of the long distance from California, but we are videotaping, so I'll say to him, "Pop, I want to thank you for your advice about always making sure that I'm in contact with Mom. I spoke with her last and talked to her about poetry and writing some things that she loved very much just days before she passed. And it was my father's advice that made sure that that happened." As for that loan shark, I never did borrow any of that money, partially because of my father's good advice, but mostly because I couldn't afford 40 bucks on payday. So, with that. The night before, there was a party of epic proportions of all of my friends, a great going away party. And my good friend Russ Stedman took me aside. He put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Young David," he always called me Young David, even though I was only 10 days younger than he was. He said, "Young David, I've got $500 in my pocket and a full tank of gas. And if you're second guessing this whole military thing, why, we can be in Canada before they even know you're missing. Russ always did have a flair for the dramatic, but I told him I was going to do just fine, and that's when he gave me a gift, a pair of dice. Well, to be specific, a pair of loaded dice. He gave them to me because he said they were for emergencies, okay? Well, I thanked him and put those dice in my pocket and went on throughout the evening. I carried those dice in my pocket all the way through boot camp. And I carried them across Europe, on midnight watches on the Iron Curtain, walls that would eventually fall. I carried them in my pocket through fierce storms at sea, migrant interdiction boardings, armed drug interdiction boardings. They were in my pocket the day that we hit the shore with the Marine Corps in a little country called Haiti. And we fell asleep behind the sandbags each night with the sound of small arms fire overhead. They were in my pocket on the day I made Chief Petty Officer. And they were in my pocket on the day that I received my warrant to become an officer in the United States Coast Guard. Now, these are the dice. My intent was, on this day, to bring my good friend forward here and return his dice to him and thank him for 27 years of their use and for over 40 years of friendship. Unfortunately, the fates intervened and my good friend recently lost his life. So, I've decided I'm going to hold on to these dice for just a little bit longer. And I've directed my family that someday, many, many years from now, when I'm laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, that these dice be placed in my pocket. I plan on giving them my good friends when I see them next in person. I also like to say some thanks before I close. First, to my children, Mason, Jordan, Brian, and Megan. Kids, it was your presence that gave me the will and the motivation to get up every single morning, even when I would rather just roll over and go back to sleep. It was thought of you that made me study a little bit harder on a service-wide, to not accept Lieutenant Robertson's first explanation of no, that's not going to happen, and continue on. I want to thank you, and I want to thank your mothers who always kept you alive in your little minds, kept me alive in your little minds, no matter where I was in the world or what adventure I was off on. I'd like to thank my sisters who are in California, Debbie, Kathy, mostly because no matter where I've gone on this planet, I've never felt alone because I always knew that my family was there. And finally, most importantly, my wife Suzanne. Susie, I know it wasn't easy to put a house together, only to have to pack everything up every few years and move along. To make good friends, only have to say goodbye. To get a good job, only have to quit and start over in some other place, right? This achievement today is every bit your achievement as well. Thank you, and I love you. And with that, the final thanks I'd like to give is to Almighty God, who pulled my hide out of more situations than I can even count, and always let me come home safely. Thank you, my friends, my shipmates, to the gunner's mates, and to my co-workers. God bless you, and God bless America.